Hello everyone, today we talk about Antoine-Henri Jomini, the pivotal military theorist, alter ego of von Clausewitz, not quite arch enemy in the end, as we will see, whose ideas shaped 19th century strategy, particularly through his systematic analysis on Napoleonic warfare. Now, for the more militarily literate of you, this name is not unknown, obviously. Some of you asked me, in fact, yourselves about this figure, to cover his thought, also his life, because just like von Clausewitz's, they are very interesting in and of themselves during the Napoleonic era and beyond, because Jomini went on living up to old age, unlike von Clausewitz that died in his 50s during the first of the major Polish insurrections. And this is a time that, as you know, we haven't quite investigated more much. We talked about Napoleonic warfare here and there, but we haven't quite a systematic approach to it. Personally, I would love to cover all this in depth, but the 19th century requires a very long, if not introduction on the wall, because at that point we would start simply talking way more in depth of this, naturally cover a bit of 19th century warfare for the sake sort of encyclopedical completion, but because of the complexity, fundamentally, of this era, that can't be articulated also in the rivalry, in the competition between von Clausewitz and Jomini, concerning, in fact, the same view of war, its broader essence, fundamentally, and how this would and could be applied in a positive art, as the same von Clausewitz called it, right? Naturally, approaching von Clausewitz and Jomini's theories is a highly philosophical task, right? I covered for years the Kriege. We translated and commented on it to essentially show, I think, in an effective way, how truly coherent, actually, say, uncomplicated, but still sort of quite composite and subtle von Clausewitz's work really is. Because a great problem in the general reception of these theorists is that, at large, especially von Clausewitz, there was the better one, or at least the one, the same Jomini, at the end of his life, said, you know what, he was actually right, which is well after von Clausewitz's own death. All right, and that therefore should make us reflect in many ways. First of all, Jomini was a great man. That phrase at the end of his life, and as we'll see now, also his vicissitudes, his philosophical production, and also military insight, confer him a gigantic moral quality. Jomini and von Clausewitz were two very different people, if not much just because they were one against the other, sort of in a political military sense at some point. There were also some aspects that they shared, basically, including their experience in the Tsarist Empire and so on. Nevertheless, this context alone is not enough to explain, essentially, what their thoughts were. We would have to enter a very deep, again, philosophical inquiry of their military theory. So for those of you who have asked me to cover this in any sort of critical analytical manner, just know that in one video it's really impossible to do so. And I actually have another couple of videos that I can do easily on Jomini. I don't know how frequently we will talk about him after this video, because I would like also to make a bit more about von Clausewitz, but I like these episodes to be digested over time. There's a very strange phenomenon whereby I still see lots of people continuously over the years watching the Kriege series, differently from some of the what I call algorithmic history videos among the many that I made. Today, we just frame the broader issue, that is to say, who was Jomini, first of all, and why did he come to believe in his military theory? Why was it different from von Clausewitz's, and what kind of importance this has in the history of the art of war? Right? I spoiled you that at the end of his life, of course, Jomini said that von Clausewitz was right, that these two massive powers, philosophical, scientific, systems really were asymmetrical, like war is to by definition, and that von Clausewitz actually holds the higher ground, right? Understanding especially the latter, not just much, again, what they believed, respectively, but also why one system was superior to another is probably the most difficult thing to do. Not much because of what I will be presenting, like the military theories with the time available today, but because it requires to accept a certain worldview inherent to Clausewitzian thought that is, while correct, in fact, like von Clausewitz says, the simplest things in war, just like in life, because basically, that's a broader scientific and moral, say, foundation that is laying out there, even though he doesn't talk about truly anything else but war, are the hardest, right? And in this sense, when I look, for example, at my several years spent teaching military history on YouTube, I realized that the most difficult thing to really understand, but also the catchiest once you actually get it, right, is to properly accept that there is no such thing like a set of predetermined rules that will simply, by following them, leading to victory, right? For Clausewitz, is the struggle, is the unknown, the fact that you have to go to basically the hardest of times and in the thickest of the fray in order to properly understand the gigantic pressure that the critical moment of a clash entails, and accept in this sense that that's the moment in which you have to push the hardest, even though that's exactly when fate grows weaker. And this is obviously counterintuitive because of human weakness. My studies in military, but also religious history, I think it's an original view on the Clausewitzian theory regarding the actually overwhelmingly traditional mold of Clausewitz's idea. Not just because he was naturally inspired to Kant and Hegel's philosophies, besides sort of living close to them, being connationals and everything in a very peculiar moment, not just in Prussian or German, but entirely European history, as we will see now with the same Jomini, with his Swiss background, but also the French involvement, Italian ancestry, and so on, right? So we're looking at a bit like how the entirety of the Napoleonic era provides, like a very deep pan-European spectrum. That's why we absolutely must, by the way, come back on Napoleonic warfare and talk way more in depth about 19th century one in general. So let's start getting acquainted with Antoine-Henri Jomini. Was born on March the 6th, 1779 in Payerne, in the Pays de Vaud region of western Switzerland, which was then a subject territory under the control of the powerful canton of Bern in the old Swiss Confederacy. I made a video about the military history of the old Swiss Confederacy, basically the end of the 18th century. This was a loose alliance of largely independent cantons, as you know. Antoine-Henri was born to Benjamin Jomini and Jeanne Marcourt. The Jominis constituted an ancient Swiss lineage with distant Italian origins recorded in Payenne's municipal archives as far back as 1340. I just recently made a video about the Swiss-Habsburgic Wars during the Middle Ages and exhibited a long-standing pro-French orientation as well. This would be, again, clearer had we made more videos about modern Swiss history, but let's say in the age we're discussing here, the one of revolution and also the times before, also Switzerland came to be heavily involved. His father, Benjamin, born 1746, died 1818, followed a diverse civic path, notary and city secretary, justiciar, commencing in 1774, banneret on an intermittent basis from 1790 to 1798, syndic, that is mayor of Payerne itself, starting in 1803. They were essentially third estaters, and deputy in the Provisional Assembly of 1798, as well as in the Grand Council of the Helvetic Republic, the short-lived centralized Swiss state established, in fact, in the same year after French revolutionary forces invaded Switzerland, overthrew the old confederation, and imposed a unitary republic inspired by French models, obviously, abolishing feudal privileges and subject territories like Vaud, as you have seen here from the titles pre and before a revolutionary wave. Of course, the same Benjamin had been covering offices, really sounding very much like two different eras apart. Well, this is the context in which, as we've seen also in a recent video about the Prussian citizenry soldiery von Scharnhorst, so that's also von Clausewitz's environment, obviously, like the same, Jomini participated in very densely ideological, right, so in this sense also stimulating, intellectually thriving, like politically direct moment in the history of mankind, with war unfolding under his very eyes. When you look at his father's career, you realize that his family's persistent influence within the local bourgeois stratum and municipal administration was an old thing, right? It had been going on for multiple generations, and so these were very well educated, affluent individuals. From the age of 12, Antoine-Henri demonstrated an intense preoccupation with soldiers and the mechanics of warfare. Interestingly enough, diligently seeking avenues for formal military instruction for himself, he first endeavored to gain entry to the military academy directed by the Duke of Württemberg at Montbéliard, but the academy's relocation to Stuttgart defeated the attempt. Not long afterward, his family sought to obtain a cadet commission for him in the Swiss regiment of Watteville, then in the employ of the same French crown. This before the revolution, but it's in fact exactly the revolutionary convulsions in France that rendered the endeavor impossible for other years, because you wouldn't even know what would end up in there. Confronted with these successive impediments, Jomini, Antoine-Henri's parents guided him toward a commercial vocation. This is also fascinating because I think of when von Clausewitz says that warfare is also like a dot test in a commercial sense. It really resembles that exchange, right? As we'll see now, because we will gradually enter the same characteristics of the same Jominian theory, trying to understand how much did even a figure like him have with von Clausewitz at this point in history. At 14, Antoine-Henri enrolled in the so-called Pension Mercantile pour Jeunes Messieurs in Aarau, instituted by Emanuel Aberstock specifically to prepare young gentlemen for mercantile occupations. In April 1795, he commenced employment at the banking house of Monsieur Preiswerk in Basel. Jomini would be a banker, essentially. In the early part of his life, Switzerland was sort of mounting up historically, that we most fantastically appreciate today. By 1796, Jomini had moved to Paris, however, initially at the Musselman banking house before assuming duties as a stockbroker and currency exchange agent. This, again, is particularly interesting. Also, as far as his military thought, as we will see now, would develop. The monotonous sanitary routine of banking affairs, however, proved profoundly discordant with Jomini's temperament and underlying aspirations. Throughout these years immersed in commerce, his authentic calling endeavored via rigorous, completely self-directed immersion in military history, with particular concentration on the campaigns of Frederick the Great of Prussia, because before Napoleon, that was just at this point moving his first steps. Naturally, Frederick, as we've seen also in the Clausewitzian theory, that is very heavily informed by Frederican military history, in that case even more because of the Prussian background, was the the thing, the deal. That's how advanced, essentially, warfare, especially in tactical terms, had ever gone, right? Through meticulous dissection of these operations, frequently undertaken in spare hours, he extracted the core strategic principles centered on concentration of force, interior lines of maneuver, and decisive engagement that he would uphold with exceptional constancy for the subsequent 70 years. All right. By the way, now I will be listing, as you hear here, the major features of Jomini's military theory. And one great advice that I've always given in the series about the Fondkriege is that you should preferably read Jomini's work, Die Précis de l'Art de la Guerre, before reading the Fondkriege, because the effect in understanding really where Jomini is lacking and at fault is going to be much better amplified in that sense. In other words, you should fall in love with Jomini before you fall in love with von Clausewitz. You have to get heartbroken a little bit at the beginning, but for the better, right? So now I will simply list what Jomini's thoughts were, what concepts were, and at the end of the video we'll see better how and why. Also, those of you who know the entire deal, okay, well, it's as if they were cheating. But let's say if you know in particular von Clausewitz thought, well, you can immediately understand what's wrong with this concept, all right? Or at least how incomplete that is, all right? Because it's not like Jomini's theories to throw away, right? It's actually a great work. It's very interesting, very insightful. Much of what is written into it does make sense. It's good, right? But there is a higher principle, right? A higher Geist that is inherent, as I was saying at the beginning, also in a better but sort of more accurately traditional understanding of reality, differently from, in fact, Jomini's sort of mostly mathematical dimension, geometrical one, the concept of internal lines, right? Inner lines, interior lines, and this idea that basically warfare, especially also in that time of linear warfare, would be reduced to basically linear matters, right? If you got the right angle of fire, etc., you would. When there are also deeper insights in here, but it's the presumption, as I was saying before, that everything can be controlled in a way or another, and or that you can basically win a battle in practical terms, like following an insight that just talks to you about this kind of geometric fashion, and not about the spirit of the fight, and how this also, depending on the condition, the situation, will even prevent you from enacting very specific, or you will not even have the time proper to think about the angle on the battlefield, all right? There are, von Clausewitz, again, we have already seen him. Now I'm talking as if, of course, there was a continuous stream of following. Many of you don't even know that I ever made that series, for that matter, but we have always treated military history through that insight, right? But von Clausewitz powerfully digresses at some point on the psychological profile, moral manners, rather than how, mostly down the work, explains how the warfare of his era worked, which also never make the mistake of presuming that it is just like how Napoleonic era worked, because the Clausewitzian work is expressly designed to describe the entirety of warfare. And at that point, just like the Napoleonic example was the sort of best, like there had never been such great of a war, and so it was sort of much more didactically effective. But we're not here just to, especially at this moment, sort of praise von Clausewitz once again, yet again. Now, the founding of the Helvetic Republic in 1798 ultimately supplied Jomini with a tangible entry into administrative and public realms. An ardent proponent of the revolutionary dispensation and close associate of Frédéric César de la Harpe, the prominent Vaudois patriot and key figure who petitioned French authorities for intervention to liberate Vaud from Bernay's rule, thereby helping trigger the French invasion that established the Helvetic Republic. He obtained the position of secretary to the Minister of War, carrying the rank of captain. Right? So this is particularly interesting because he finally realized his dream to be in an important military position and to witness to war firsthand. So as you understand, he was also a revolutionary. The reason why before I said that we should talk more about 19th century warfare is not peregrine, just to dilute the video. As some of you may think, because there's always a specific reference to this. It's extremely difficult to teach this in a sort of military, not just militarily abstract, but probably also political and socially abstract sense. The same von Clausewitz would concur, as a matter of fact. And especially in the moral dimension of what did it actually mean for these people to side with French Revolution. I am speaking, for example, mostly to an audience sort of normally raised through a very specific, not necessarily negative, mostly negative, but in part surely also positive. That's not the point, but still very Anglo-American influence regarding the sort of very Burkean sort of idea of the French Revolution. And so some sort of perversion, some sort of tyranny and whatever. But it seems to me that without studying the national histories of the various European countries, one can't properly understand how important this moment was and how and why this change was occurring, regardless of the masses, sort of the, in that sense, the focus that we mostly have today. We have developed sort of a philosophy, a history, a perception, a history that mostly thinks about the masses when looking at also mass society, ignoring that all this was run, as still today, fortunately, is by the elites, by the establishment, not surely by sort of large amounts of people, as a matter of fact. And there is always sort of even a traditional element running within the most ferocious revolutionary movements in here that people sort of simply disqualify because they don't know the history of it to begin with, let's be honest, but also simply excuse themselves for it just by saying, I don't know, it was all trash, I don't need to study whatever these continental Europeans were doing. But it's important in particular in this case because it shows you how, for example, even within Switzerland, that you would think to be, again, a mostly sort of individualistic and self-centered mechanism, still the national spirit, and in this sense, like, you know, with a community being free from a local candidate that, again, that existed just a few tens of kilometers away, was actually a huge deal, right? Just as, you know, foreign occupation was, in a broader national sense in other countries out there in Europe, and the French Revolution represented not just an enormous novelty, but at the same time something that responded, if anything, because it succeeded to break out and to maintain the nation-state fundamentals, questions, answers that were very actual at the time, right? It's also very weird that you have this strange attachment for the nation state among the same people in that sort of Burkean sense, or at least Anglo-American one, from a conservative side, without realizing that it's the French Revolution fundamentally unlocked the concept, right, over other sort of countries as well. And so there are so many intellectual and historical short circuits when you browse even superficially the sort of the online space, but this is not what I'm going to discuss today. And remember that I have the von Clausewitz avatar, so you can't even accuse me of sort of siding with the French Revolution, which I sort of, as a medievalist especially, gives me like repeated several heartbreaks at the same remembrance, let's say, of what happened as a consequence of that, especially in France. But aside from this, it's not so simple. And there are certain leaps forward in the history of civilization that the Prussian case beautifully shows, because very far from being a reactionary, feudal kind of, that failed anyways, you know, in the bloodbath of Vienna, Auerstedt, to the French Revolution was actually an imitation and even an improvement of the system, actually. Definitely a Sonderweg, a German adaptation to the circumstances of that country, because it's not the same. Napoleon did not really advocate for a mere copy of a Jacobin state across all of Europe, because he understood it was unfeasible. It was mostly a matter of sort of certain states, certain nations being already more advanced, more predisposed for receiving a specific level of centralization, of larger scale military capacity, etc. But we'll see better all this in another video. But back to Jomini. Promoted to major between 1799 and 1800, he assumed responsibility for the thorough overhaul of the ministry's operations, instituting standardized protocols and actively experimenting with organizational architectures and preliminary strategic concepts. Right? His banking experience obviously had sort of predisposed him to some organizational dimensions, understanding the economy of it. This was within basically a French protege status, while essentially acting still as a Swiss. Now, following the Peace of Luneville in 1801, the treaty that ended out Austrian participation in the war of the Second Coalition against revolutionary France, confirming French gains west of the Rhine and recognizing satellite republics while marking a temporary respite in the broader Napoleonic wars, Jomini returned to Paris and accepted employment with a manufacturer of military equipment, arm dealers, specifically the manufacturer de François Depont at 52 Rue de Grenelle, specialized in headgear, by the way. I mean, uniforms, we make multiple videos about their history, they're sort of scaling up like production, like mass society at this point for revolutionary France. Predictably, however, a post Jomini found lacking in stimulation. He channeled the major portion of his intellectual vigor into composing his inaugural substantial scholarly work, the Traité de Grande Opération Militaire, originally conceived as a critical and comparative analysis of Frederick II's campaigns juxtaposed against emerging contemporary practices. Marshal Michel Ney, among Napoleon's most distinguished commanders, reviewed the manuscript in 1803 and provided financial backing for its publication. It was indeed very interesting because, as we've seen also in the video about Prussia recently, Frederick II's wars were Ancien Regime wars. They were not mass wars. They were still functioning, in fact, even logistically, on an incredibly different basis compared to the one of the centralized French state at this point. Thus, Ney realized also for the sake of Napoleon at the end of the day that these ideas were quite fruitful because they were measuring the doctrine essentially as it was coming. And in like 2 years later, you have the war of the Third Coalition that I covered in detail, and that is Napoleon's masterpiece, as a matter of fact, from both a strategic and tactical point of view, with Austerlitz and all. So you understand how seminal these moments really are for the theory of the art of war. Jomini was from the French side. This released gradually in multiple volumes from 1804 to 1810, commencing under designations such as Traité de Grande Tactique before adopting its definitive form and incorporating detailed maps, operational diagrams, and analytical commentary. Jomini's treatise achieved a rapid dissemination and translation across Europe. I would like to stress that von Clausewitz's thoughts before the Franco-Prussian War were not properly even translated from German, right? Obviously, what was happening in France, and now at such high levels for Ney to sponsor such theories, was worth of the undivided attention of everyone involved. So we can imagine von Clausewitz too being well aware of such work as well. That makes it all the more fascinating. And this publication, by the way, firmly established Jomini's reputation as a clear-sighted, pragmatic elucidator of operational principles. In 1804, Jomini himself volunteered for French service as aide-de-camp to Ney at the Boulogne encampment that we have seen exactly in the preparations of the War of the Third Coalition. This was, in theory, actually, as you know, the expeditionary force for the conquest of Britain. attached to the 6th Corps, Jomini took part in the 1805 campaign itself against Austria, contributing himself to the encirclement at Ulm, one of, as you know, greatest masterpieces that Napoleon ever carried out. The march across the Black Forest, the encirclement, soldiers walking while sleeping, but being fed also by this organization. This broader operational insight was taking shape in the French army, was fully maturing at this point, and where in fact Ney's corps played a crucial role in severing Austrian retreat paths, notably at Elchingen on October the 14th, and observing the strategic development that led to Austerlitz itself, although the 6th Corps remained attached to the Tyrol, right? It was there the possibility of flank attack to the Danubian axis of advance of the French. It thus, the same Jomini with Ney did not participate directly in the final, in the climax, in the final engagement on the Pratzen. The Ulm campaign was nevertheless bringing glory to the same Jomini's insights as Napoleon's masterpiece of maneuver warfare, where the Grande Armée rapidly enveloped and forced the surrender at Ulm of an entire Austrian army under General Mack, with minimal fighting, by the way, and losses, paving the way for the decisive victory at Austerlitz later that year. Napoleon made aware of the Traité himself, and having sections read to him at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna in December 1805, just imagine the scene, definitely crowns and glorifies Jomini's work, right? Imagine like you had really started, again, from this Swiss third estate in a de facto provincial situation, and the emperor that has basically taken over even your old sort of rivals of Switzerland with that sort of masterpiece, while you had really contributed to the same sort of informing of the military theory that contributed to this victory, like naturally in a sort of quite tertiary sense, so to say. But changes everything. Your life, you're in the seventh heaven, like you're through the roof. Napoleon reportedly expressed surprise at Jomini's insights into, in fact, Napoleon's own methods, right? Observing that he risked exposing his system too openly to adversaries by publishing this work. So this is masterful. Again, understanding fully what Napoleon was doing. As I imagine this, even I say it from a historian's perspective, as a military historian's perspective, being able to document, to nail exactly what was going on with Napoleon, by the way, to the point that Napoleon himself recognizes that you got exactly what he was up to in a broader military sense, like philosophically, personally, and morally, intellectually, is huge. And this recognition led, in fact, to Jomini's attachment to imperial headquarters for the Prussian and Polish campaigns of 1806, 1807, including, by the way, the destruction of Prussia, right? And von Clausewitz was there, right? In fact, Jomini himself was present at Jena. He entered Berlin with the Grande Armée under the gate, the port of Brandenburg, and fought at Eylau. That was one of the bloodiest battles against the Russians. In the snow, it was a terrible thing, like the French were about to be wiped out. And basically there you have the Peace of Tilsit. So this is the peak, actually, of Napoleon's power, as you know. And for his services in this campaign, Jomini earned the Cross of the Légion d'honneur. That is, as you know, sublime. It's the top French National Order of Merit, both military and civil. In this case, again, Jomini was probably in the Grande Armée when he received the honorificence on May the 14th, 1807. Now, in 1808, Napoleon conferred upon him the title of Baron of the Empire by letters patent dated to July the 27th, 1808. So again, he was born third estater, a bourgeois. He became proper nobility. He continued as Ney's chief of staff during the opening phase of the Spanish campaign, rendering advice of considerable value, though escalating tensions with Ney and deepening animosity from Marshal Louis-Alexandre Berthier, the emperor's chief of staff, gradually eroding Jomini's position. Right? It would be interesting to make a series about all the various Napoleonic marshals that were, as you know, quite protagonistically like the fire, the enactors, the enforcers of Napoleon's thought. It was probably a temper of these, in the broader imperial establishment at this point. Like these were, for example, very different generals. They were from the ones of the age of Louis XIV, right? Even just by character, Napoleon was fiery, right? Was aggressive, was bold, and so on. And all his marshals at large were loaded in the same way, and especially the top ones. Louis XIV was a cold, calm, measured guy. Aside from Vauban, all these generals were kind of similar. Jomini himself, actually, to comparison, was a very sort of introspective, also somehow detached person. He wasn't like a bold cock. You would imagine an Arabist or someone who has sort of a deeper, sort of aggressive purpose and elan. He loved the military, but he was still a very thoughtful, even introverted person. Now, from 1807, overtures at that point to Jomini arrived from the Tsarist court. Right, upon learning of the intended shift, Napoleon compelled Jomini's retention, promoting him brigadier general in December 1810, specifically on December the 7th, and reassigned him to the historical section of the general staff to compile the Histoire critique et militaire de guerre de la Révolution, ultimately published in 15 volumes from 1811 to 1824. This stuff, by the way, is all public. If you're interested, of course, in reading them, it's really good. Of course, even translations exist from the time, even so. You'll find the English version, but you should actually study this from French, just like you should study von Clausewitz from German. Because they, especially for the latter, like there is a much deeper, so there are some concepts that cannot be expressed until you properly master German to a degree. Now, this work embraced political, diplomatic, operational, maritime, and colonial dimensions as well. Again, Jomini maintained some degree of banker's thought, mentality, and also practical insight. In the 1812 campaign, Jomini executed administrative and logistical duties in rare areas that were key for the nightmarish expedition into Russia. He was, in fact, appointed governor of Vilnius from August 11th and subsequently Smolensk from October the 8th. Despite severe illness, von Clausewitz will die on campaign, different illness, as a matter of fact, a mortal one, in fact, differently from Jomini. The latter identified the critical Studienka ford on the Berezina. Right? This deeply aided the French. It facilitated Marshal Ney's celebrated rearguard action that preserved the surviving elements of the Grande Armée from total annihilation. As you know, basically the Russians were basically themselves suffering like hell. The French were trapped, but they successfully, albeit obviously with heavy losses given the dreadful situation, we will see that campaign, managed to cross back into Lithuania. Well, this we owe it also to Jomini. In 1813, Jomini resumed active field duty as chief of staff to Ney's group of corps, providing distinguished service at Lutzen and preeminently at Bautzen on May the 20th to the 21st. In the latter engagement, a hard-fought French victory in the spring campaign against the Tsarist Hohenzollern coalition, Jomini's planning contributed to pushing back the Allies, though the victory was incomplete as they escaped destruction. Ney recommended him for promotion to general division, but Berthier struck the name from the list, placed him under arrest and issued a public censure for allegedly delayed staff reports, a charge Jomini regarded as baseless and trivial, by the way. Because, by the way, he had, again, a long life, and as you can imagine, for all those people having lived through the actual deal throughout the entire 19th century, even at the thresholds of World War One, like there would be an enormous amount also of historical research from the side of even people like him that had already been military historians that were documenting Napoleon, the revolution as they were happening back in the day. So naturally, it's difficult to also today describe what European countries' relations were, even in such after blood and during such bloody events like the ones of the 19th century, with still a level of cordiality, especially in the higher spheres, and an idea of also necessary congregational, universal sharing, like sort of, especially for a nobleman, like living abroad, having international connection, was completely normal. And in fact, it is also at this point that during the ensuing armistice, Jomini executed his long-intended transfer to Tsarist service on August the 14th of 1813. Many French officers condemned the action as desertion, by the way, and with good reason, by the way. Yet, Jomini had maintained a dormant Tsarist commission for several years, had deliberately refrained from combat participation in the 1812 invasion, and as a Swiss citizen rather than a Frenchman, perceived the move as consistent with national loyalty, if not sort of personal interest, as he could justify that. So obviously, and historically, things would have been very different. Had he probably been a noble of blood, likely his upbringing would have made him behave in a different way. But here, we're also talking about the French, from the revolutionary era. So obviously, nobility from that side was also something debatable. Now, Tsar Alexander I received Jomini with the rank of lieutenant general and the appointment of aide de camp. Jomini contributed to planning during the German campaign of 1813. So imagine this, by the way, it's two different things. It's not like the Prussians and the Russians like one another, but von Clausewitz is also back. He had been exiled in Russia. There's a famous passage by Tolstoy, whose work we will also mention later, in War and Peace, where von Clausewitz appears as one of the characters en passant. And so you see there that von Clausewitz, again, the reputation in general here between the two sides is completely sort of separated from the theory of the respective authors. So that's not something we discuss in that sense. But even imagine knowing essentially what was happening. Not much to one another, because I think Jomini at that point was not yet aware of von Clausewitz. But in any case, surely was easier for everyone to know who Jomini was. So this was important for von Clausewitz as well. And he, by the way, contributed, to the Allied advance into France in 1814. Von Clausewitz will have also a non-irrelevant role in the prodromes to the Battle of Waterloo, right, in the campaign at large. There is thus some sort of important siding connection in the motivations, in the siding, and so on. Jomini's firm Swiss patriotism induced a temporary withdrawal from coalition operations in 1814, however, when the Allies violated Swiss neutrality. And that's the price that you pay for not realizing certain things. In any case, there's not a thing he could have done about it. In 1815, attached to the Tsar in Paris, Jomini exerted persistent but unsuccessful efforts to prevent Marshal Ney's execution, as you know, following the Bourbon Restoration. Jomini participated in the St. Congress of Vienna, as well as those of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1818 and Verona in 1822, where he influenced Alexander's position on the independence of the Vaud from Berd for his Swiss purposes. At the Congress of Vienna between 1814 and 1815, this occurred while Napoleon's 100 days were going on, but ultimately, in fact, passing that Waterloo, etc., and redrawing Europe's map after Napoleon's defeat and exile, the great powers guaranteed Switzerland's perpetual neutrality and recognized the independence of cantons like Vaud, previously a Bernese subject territory, as we were saying, as part of the restored Swiss Confederation of 22 cantons. In Tsarist service, Jomini advanced to full general en chef, in 1826. Naturally, French was very much prominent in the military sphere, and for obvious reasons, and even, the classics of Russian literature contain pretty large parts in French, notoriously. And that's probably the level of international culture Europeans shared back in the day. Now, Jomini advised Nicholas I throughout the Russo-Turkish War of 1828, receiving the Grand Cordon of the Order of St. Alexander Nevsky at the Siege of Varna. From the early 1820s, he dedicated himself to the military education of the Tsarevich Nicholas, the later Nicholas I, and subsequently the future Alexander II, while playing a central role in the establishment and organization of the Nicholas Academy and the General Staff established in 1832. Although court intrigues, as always in Russia, prevented his appointment as its first director, the Nicholas Academy, Russia's premier institution for training general staff officers, formalized advanced military education and doctrine, with Jomini promoting systematic instruction in strategy and logistics. He commissioned Russian translations of his earlier treatises for instructional purposes and promoted systematic training in strategy and logistics. After a phase of semi-retirement devoted to extensive literary production, thankfully for us, Jomini resumed advisory duties during the Crimean War. In fact, we have a series ongoing about that. And so, yes, Jomini was still around, and naturally, he had his age, but think about this, because von Clausewitz was dead from 20 years, but this is not yet the time in which things would sort of conflagrate in a theoretical sense, nor, again, as we'll see later, Jomini actually had much to criticize in that regard. Jomini departed St. Petersburg upon the conclusion of peace and settling principally in Brussels for 3 decades. So again, very long life, across also some of the bloodiest episodes of those generations. However, if you had survived the retreat from Russia, that would look like a joke to you. In 1859, Napoleon III solicited Jomini's views on campaign planning for the Franco-Austrian War, the Second Italian War of Independence. That was a big affair, just like the Crimean War, and that witnessed a huge deal, sort of doctrinal novelties. And again, this was a greatly fermenting moment for a further step in the history of the art of war. Jomini spent his final years at Passy, near Paris, at number 129 Rue de la Tour, which had just been incorporated into the 16th arrondissement, as Paris was literally booming at this point in urban expansion. Continuing, by the way, to compose treatises, pamphlets, and historical analysis until his death on March the 22nd, 1869, at the age of 90. What a life, right? He was interred on March the 25th of the same year in the Montmartre Cemetery in the 11th Division. So I always think that when you look at somebody's thought, you have to first understand his life. There is not much time, as I was saying, in general, to properly describe Jomini's military theory, but there are lots of insights that are incredibly relevant for our Clausewitzian theory. So first of all, Jomini's vast corpus, exceeding 30 major titles, culminated in the aforementioned Précis de l'art de la guerre, dating to 1838. It was a comprehensive synthesis that refined the preliminary tableau analytique of 1830 and that basically incorporated adjustments prompted by the 1832 posthumous publication of von Clausewitz's Vom Kriege. I also made a video about Marie von Clausewitz's introduction to her husband's work, right? And there is a heartbreaking story because, as you know, von Clausewitz died essentially just a few months before ending the work, and much of the misunderstanding also deriving sometimes from the von Krieg is that this would have been allegedly like an incomplete work, or that there would have been a book missing. Absolutely, he literally stated that before dying, written on a note. We don't know exactly when, but probably when he realized that it was to pass, which makes it even more beautiful. But just to read the work, that his insights, even though there was something to adjust here and there, were correct. That the work, if you gain familiarity with the method, like with the probably the genius, even in expression, and the incredibly vast and deep sense of sort of vision of war as it is, but also for everybody to really understand. This is very important. Is there. The work functions pretty well. And there is also a paradox in the sense that von Clausewitz's work not just was received later, and in general, even when the thing became quite famous, still poorly, but this is another story also. Jomini has nothing to do with that. Von Clausewitz's work was a work written by a military man, field marshal, that would be written to be understood also by, and clamorously in the sense also accepted by, civilians, right? The von Krieg had a massive success among civilians, right? And for reasons that we're not going to discuss here. But paradoxically, Jomini's work was mostly appreciated by the military, even though he wasn't a professional militaryman, as we've seen here. Yes, he went through all these campaigns, but essentially as a field aide, he didn't have, other than operationally or logistically, any greater sort of strategic influence in the conduction of the war and so on. This is a real paradox, because if you think about the age of positivism that will kick in a bit later in Jomini's life, nevertheless, at the peak of his fame, right, he was a revered figure, right, in this later decades that we just described. The Précis is incredibly in tune with it. It's containing this notion that you can fundamentally sort out everything, that you can calculate all aspects. It's paradoxical that even within the Prussian armed forces, also the ones of unified Germany, etc., there would be this attitude, not because of the Précis, but because of this conviction that regardless of the inherently like sort of Clausewitzian character of the German doctrine, already at that time, there could be some reliance on every single element of the mechanism. Think about the so-called Schlieffen plan and so on. We discussed this in different ways. It was the age of this overconfidence, over-reliance on fixed measures. There is all a literature even mocking that. I mean, if you're familiar with English author, like, I don't have to make any names. The Précis organized the art of war into 6 interconnected branches. Statesmanship in relation to war, so essentially diplomatic evaluations determining the suitability, timing, and objectives of war. Strategy, as the direction of masses on the theater for invasion or defense. That already in and of itself, it's more like a merchant's idea. We'll understand now how. Grand tactics, I'm talking Jomini here, so we know from the von Krieg that there is sort of much different terminology even in the Clausewitzian theory. So this grand tactics for Jomini would be the combination and conduct of battles, obviously, well, okay. Grand tactics referring to sort of bigger engagements. Logistics is a practical art of moving and sustaining armies, a term he helped advance, as we've seen also from his financial literacy. Engineering, fortification and siege operations, and minor tactics, as he says, it's a small unit dispositions. And we talk about the Précis because naturally that's the summa ultima, right? Jomini here emphasized that while war in its entirety remained an art subject to the permanent influence of genius, morale, national character, passions of the masses, so he definitely had gotten it. All right, he was a child of his era, after all. The spirit of the nations, the romantic ideal of this rising identities, moving masses, and commander energy. Think about, he was with Napoleon, he was with Ney, right? And what he called the unpredictable, quote, poetry and metaphysics of combat, by the way. Strategy and operations, this was his deeper belief, could be subjected to a limited set of regulative principles resembling those of positive sciences. And you immediately understand how much of his work and themes, and this is kind of obvious given the nature of this work, overlap with von Clausewitz, but his convictions are truly inverted, right? So they both knew from direct personal experience how an army worked, right? How it was commanded, what you could do to improve, again, even in fighting, everything. So they were talking about the same thing. But in here, essentially in the précis, that again, the same Jomini will accept to be wrong in this, because he had finally admitted that von Clausewitz had gotten it right. You have a vision where basically, yeah, reality is messy, but if you basically stick to some sort of limited set of rules and you can impose them, you will win through them. Von Clausewitz says the complete opposite. Von Clausewitz says that there are some tendencies, some patterns, some vectors, more than else, that there is an ultimate point of war, that it's absolute and properly absolutus, really, so unregulated, pure action, basically, and one that would ipso facto freeze, by the way, any movement. It's a metaphysical concept, if you want. He doesn't articulate it with a religious lens or whatever, but the fundamental principle is there. Even just if you study German philosophy, aside from the fact he was very well educated also in sciences and technology, so he shared really a lot with Jomini by education, and had an even bigger one, as a matter of fact. He tells us that while there is a package of practical insight that you can give, as he also explains in the Vom Krieg at length, on how to command an army, what you have to do in detail, like mostly talking about Napoleonic era, and how to literally set up objectives, camps, formations, all what you will have to do in a campaign. He actually tells us that it's exactly the opposite, that all the things that here Jomini describes as far as genius, morale, national character, passions of the masses, commander energy, the unpredictable poetry, metaphysics of combat, strategy and operations, etc., all must be mastered in a original, contingent, and in this sense, unrestrained way, or at least one that will be fundamentally restrained by the limitations of warfare, just in a physical sense, because, again, warfare is extremely costly, difficult, messy, whatever. The purpose of the commander in that sense is to actually surpass those, and so to actually not subordinate warfare to a set of rules that will, in Jomini's theory, instantiate in, again, literally how you deploy troops in this or that manner, but literally travalicating that limit through essentially a moral force, then again, certain characteristics that are still moral, intended properly in a personal sense, of the commander in the moment through a genius, coup d'oeil, a general, experience, capacity, etc., and fundamentally in a manner that, in this sense, must be described in this moral, almost spiritual sense. That is to say, how do you have to sort of prepare yourself for what is going to happen in a moral sense, for example, to cope with the sheer pressure deriving from a commanding position, what you have to do when everything seems to be crumbling around you, where everything is messy, when you will not have, as a matter of fact, even by wanting it, a set of sort of tools that you can't use at this or that moment, at any moment, just like, I don't know, fake news constantly. You don't know where the enemy is. There is a fog of war. There is attrition. There's all a mess. Well, what matters for von Clausewitz is how you react to that and how you can predispose a commander to that. And he says also experience is far superior than any preset rule. We understand how Jomini's ideas are fundamentally positivistic instead, right? And in this regard, simply opening to an idea, an action that by default travalicates any box that could be established. In other words, warfare is asymmetrical by definition, and even where there's some set of rules that by, in that sense, it's conflicting with properly the fundamental philosophical principle, like there aren't these rules, or at least they don't work, you can't preset them, but warfare in and of itself would simply overwhelm them. And even if that was metaphysical for some reason, a set of rules that in the moment would work, still warfare is dynamic, as we've recently seen in the video about the Schwerpunkt. You can't expect in a fight that will still be fought, in fact, for all the reasons for which countries go at war, the enemy will find a way beyond those rules and will essentially establish new ones. And there is basically nothing you can do to prevent that. And so great part of Jomini's work is actually correct if, he says that, catching an enemy between two fires is more effective than, just, using that in a frontal sense. The flank attack is obviously out there in the Clausewitzian theory and so on. Again, most of the two theorists' concepts overlapped is the philosophical paradigm that is inverted, right? And Jomini is also more, not germane, but let's say he sees this mostly as a preset of dispositions rather than something that routinely and in any case evolves as properly the dynamic of warfare itself in order for these two moral forces to overcome one another. This is also the Clausewitzian view about this, right? So this is a radical difference, and I think it's even more meaningful that Jomini had the intellectual honesty and the great moral merit to finally accept that von Clausewitz was right, that war is really that unpredictable, and in that sense, the only set of rules that you have to create is the one to get to prepare yourself in order to realize that there is no rules that are going to work and that you will have to improvise in the moment, provided that, of course, also warfare has a specific practice. There is a military theory, a doctrine, a military history and experience, but the both of them, by the way, were great military historians. Also, von Clausewitz had an incredibly deep understanding of military history, including all those clashes, by the way, that were fought by what he calls like savage peoples that actually account for sort of basically pre-modern, also Europeans for that matter, and that are non-civilized populations, even at some points in European history, especially in antiquity. That revealed that he was perfectly aware of the more fragmented kind of political landscapes, of the Middle Ages, and that he's not describing at all just a Napoleonic style of war. He's describing what war is in and of itself. But this is also very philosophically important because von Clausewitz, in order to make you understand what war is as a whole, needs to abstract a lot, especially in the beginning. That to some people is confusing, and they almost don't see how deeply entwined with the practice of the art of war that actually is. Because they prefer to read a Jomini who tells you, okay, you have to deploy troops in this way according to these schemes and you will basically win the battle, right? I'm simplifying, but that's the fundamental direction. It's probably an inverted perspective, right? Jomini's operational doctrine derived from exhaustive examination of the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Caesar, Frederick the Great, and Napoleon. Naturally, von Clausewitz does the same, to maneuver in such a way as to engage fractions of the enemy army with the mass of one's own forces, for example, is what Jomini advocates. Practically speaking, what does this mean? Well, that he basically believed that you should always, it is correct, that warfare basically consists in putting the enemy in a condition of asymmetry, for which that favors you in that case, and so that you should take out enemy forces in detail. That's kind of obvious. Von Clausewitz's objection in a theoretical sense is, how do you even find yourself in that situation, right? Why would the enemy let himself be found in that situation? Especially, how do you avoid to find yourself into that situation, right? Von Clausewitz explains to us that, for example, the bigger the engagements, the more balanced the odds, and so that you don't have even so many options at the end of the day, especially in a bigger context that is the more strategically meaningful one, to, in this sense, destroy the enemy in detail. You should always seek to do so. At some point you can obviously achieve it, but it grows less likely the more important the picture is. In Napoleonic warfare, in this sense, had also showed it fairly clearly. It had brought the thing at a bigger scale that had also proportionally rendered warfare a much greater sort of direct clash, in fact, of national wills, rather than, in that sense, okay, well, let's simply destroy the enemy. In a bigger sense, where that of course, Napoleon did that many times. Why? That's it. Because adversaries were politically and socially limited in many ways, or did not properly have a vision. I mean, the idea of the French Revolution, of the nation state, of the centralized mass military and so on, it was for a while really unattainable by ancien regimes by definition, right? And so, thanks my eyes to a degree, but not even then, actually, an enemy that with that limitation would simply sit there to get butchered in detail, right? He will make things more difficult and will also recur to some, for example, as we'll see now, Jomini is very much like a proponent of you should always gain the initiative. Yes, okay, but what about what lays inherently in the offensive as opposed to the defensive, right? It's not like, again, it just takes to have Napoleon's armies to win wars all the time, right? Von Clausewitz explains to us, for example, that the offensive is the positive form of war. So he agrees with Jomini in that sense, that it should be always preferable, right? But it's also the weak one, meaning that the defensive gives up the initiative to the enemy, and this is detrimental, but also has an inherent advantage in relative terms when engagement comes. Jomini says you have to project superior force successfully upon decisive points of the theater of war. So he basically follows a sort of map as opposed to consider, for example, the Schwerpunkt, that I recently made an entire video on, showing how changing it is and how, in this sense, much more and infinitely leveled it can be for von Clausewitz, and how continuously changing, whereas Jomini is looking at things more like step by step, right? He, for example, says that you should prefer threatening the adversary's communications without compromising one's own. And this was also the big problem. You don't even have to look at mass warfare. This was the problem of the armies of the 7 Years' War times, right? They had massive supply trains and logistical connections differently from the armies of the Napoleonic era that did not basically have any train, if not for the irreplaceable sort of artillery horses from the fatherland, but literally lived off the land, because it was much easier in that sense to also overwhelm just by sheer mass. But in that sense, von Clausewitz spends a lot of time describing how difficult it is to outflank the enemy, and how and why would the enemy let himself be outflanked? Wouldn't it be like a normal thing that everybody's able to put up with, like in every military situation, normally? Like what are the sort of biggest battles and wars in the history of mankind, which are just like the guy cut off my communication? Like, it does not happen. It's mostly just like always the bigger the engagement, more of a frontal thing, right? Because you can't, also the bigger you are, the more you can't quite simply move around, or would have even the strategic say, convenience of doing. Von Clausewitz says actually, like, at that point, the stronger you are, the more directly you should punch, right? And the smaller you are, the more you actually jeopardize your condition in trying to outflank a bigger enemy. Naturally, again, this does not mean that in a specific amount of circumstances this can't be done or shouldn't be done. Absolutely not. This is also beyond von Clausewitz and Jomini. They understood it naturally as intelligent people. This means that just like the likelihood that is going to happen, that you're going to have even the opportunity of doing that, is increasingly slim. The more obvious it becomes for the enemy, for example, to be destroyed by such asymmetry, right? So you understand how more effervescently genial von Clausewitz is from an intellectual and scientific point of view, right? And Jomini says also that these series of attacks should be timed with precision and executing them with requisite vigor. So he literally sticks to a more positivistic pattern. He basically says, okay, you should basically pre-plan this, and that during the campaign. And we all know that every plan needs to be modification at the first contact with the enemy. Von Clausewitz tells us you should identify more or less the obvious of what you should and could do, because von Clausewitz attributes a strategic value even to simple sort of options that I have not verified in reality. But he tells us, look, it's not like Jomini would have not understood this, but the way he conceptualizes it is inherently deviant from the much more real description von Clausewitz says of it. You have this first objective, okay, you try to achieve it, then see what happens. You will see that any plan that you will have done for the next steps will have changed. And as we've seen also in the video about the Schwerpunkt, this change is not merely a matter of objective after objective, but it's literally the fact that the objective itself changes. It's not something static you can simply identify at the beginning of a campaign, unless it's something enormous and may be in a broader picture the Schwerpunkt of it whole. But that very thing could and would change over time. Aside from the fact that this also, in fact, largely depends from politics, it depends from all a set of circumstances in war that do not isolate the strictly military dimension from others, right? Jomini advocates to exploit interior lines for rapid redeployment and successive blows against divided opponents. And again, interior lines normally work better in the defensive, but in general, yes, you should exploit that. But I don't know why. Is the enemy stupid? Like, doesn't do that? I mean, these things are to be done. Von Clausewitz would simply tell you, once you do it, you could still fail badly, right? Because there is another level that has nothing to do with interior lines that you may have not considered that will in any case change. Even if you gain a temporary advantage with that, the enemy will adapt to it, right? So it's as if, I don't know, Jomini was fighting against dumb AI in video games, and says, oh, look, I can defeat them. I can get, with one strike, 30 kills, etc. But, in the real event, in the real action, things will evolve in a way you can't quite simply pinpoint and say, oh, well, I tried this time, it failed. Let me try this other time. There's all a set of circumstances that will always change, and you will not have the opportunity to win. Not even would you have the opportunity to exploit that specific advantage in the moment, right? So I would like to exploit interior lines for rapid redeployment and successive blows against divided opponents. For Clausewitz will tell you moral forces prevail, that you can have even the best army and still lose badly, right? Jomini advocates to seize and retain the initiative through offensive action. Thanks my eyes. The enemy sits there, you can hit him. That's the point of it all. Like, you have more time to do what you want to do in a more creative, combined arms fashion. Von Clausewitz perfectly agrees, but again, what's the practical purpose of simply stating it or pointing it out, right? Will gaining the offensive yield the desired result? because it's not necessarily the case, especially if the enemy has given up his initiative. This is bad for him. It's not good, right? But in relative terms, for example, if he is inferior to you and cannot really meet you on equal ground, he will at that point invest on the defensive that has, at least in relative terms, the ones that he will dictate if he sits there and you have, for example, the initiative to attack him from different directions, but not necessarily, for example, to cut off his supply lines without being exposed yourself by the enemy counteroffensive, for example. Be able, for example, to wear you out. And von Clausewitz also explains to us in very scientific terms, you may not even be able to calculate that. Because it's not simply a matter of numbers, it's not simply a matter of how do you calculate even the effect of supplies or terrain, whatever. This is incalculable in the moment. Right? Not even today with AI, we are minimally close to any kind of approaching even an idea that we can't calculate everything and having concrete results on this basis. That's also what the Clausewitzian theory is perfect in a sense, because to surpass that limit is also, for example, in AI terms, to surpass literally the limit in our own programming, right? And we do not see in an imperfect world, even materially speaking, that the way to program something to sort out everything needs to be sorted, or even for us to understand later if following it was actually a good or bad thing. So in this sense, this is very interesting, because that same positivism, technologism, and all what, especially in the mid-19th century, was ramping up from Clausewitz, if anything, did not witness much of that because he died before. But in this sense, resonates much more with us, and in this sense, sort of predisposing us as modern people to a more favorable interpretation of Jomini's work, right? Whereas von Clausewitz's genius lays in the realization that what matters to prepare yourself for war is mostly a moral dimension, the capacity to do something in a way that does not seek the millimetric evaluation or even a 100% perfect plan, but it's essentially spotting what in general should be done in a more likely way to win this battle in every contingent situation. In this sense, Jomini is much more sclerotic in his assessment. He's too confident that simply this abstract set of rules will adapt to the harsh reality of warfare in its ever-changing fashion that is designed exactly to surpass those rules, right? To probably bring, if you corner the enemy on a level, he will, flip the board and play on another one, right? And warfare pressures you exactly to sort that out. So not to play by the rules. And that's actually how you know how to wage war, as a matter of fact. Jomini says to strike the enemy's weakest point or cut him off from bases while protecting one's own lines of supply. So you see that this doesn't hold water to the much higher concept of Schwerpunkt, that is what here? We discussed it. Many people think that the Schwerpunkt is the enemy's weakest point. No, as far as we know, it could even be the strongest one, right? Or something that lays even outside of it. It can be the number of his forces. It can be a place, the terrain in the theater to control. It can be everything, really. Jomini simply tells us, no, it's the enemy's weak point. And what is the weak point in this sense? Because you see, even philosophically speaking, compared to the Schwerpunkt, the weakest point is a relative term to what exactly? Right? And what does a point mean here? We're referring to the enemy's forces, or again, the terrain. Is it, what you can enact also with a maneuver? What can the enemy do? Because the point at that point would seem to shift. In fact, just like the Schwerpunkt does in the Clausewitzian theory, right? And again, cutting the enemy off from his bases while protecting your own lines of supply is like, well, guess what? Naturally, Jomini is an intelligent person, so he makes his cases for everything, but it's all very much like sticking to something that in war will change on a regular basis, right? He's apparently also significantly influenced by certain things. For example, he saw in the wars of Frederick II, like, for example, always trying to outflank the enemy to cut the supply line. But it's not entirely about that. You can fight off and break out of a very specific military situation just by going against this principle in certain moments, right? So the degree by which, for example, you should do this, in the way you should prioritize objectives as they unfold, as the enemy surprises you as well, is not quite there in Jomini in the way in which von Clausewitz describes it in a much more accurate sense. Jomini stressed the advantages of dispersion preceding concentration, which is also the later Prussian adage, getrennt marschieren, vereint schlagen. We've seen it in the recent video about Alexander's march towards Bactria, for example, from Hyrcania. In that case, there were also logistical reasons for it. And this is in part the same, actually, across Europe at a much bigger scale, checkerboard, during the Napoleonic Wars. You know, the great offensives across Central Europe, I mean, they had normally like a stronger sort of column, and then other corps that were operating in secondary tiers. But everything is also very very ad hoc in that regard. So dispersion, yes, to eventually attack in a place where the enemy does not realize that you are. But what about those situations in which you must actually remain concentrated because, for example, the enemy will otherwise exploit your inferiority, right, and beat you in details at that point. So you see, there are also some general Jomini understood the concept. He was saying things that here and there will work, right? It's a bit like when you think of Sun Tzu, that naturally is very different from Clausewitz and Jomini. People do not understand it because they don't realize that there are 2.5 millennia of East and West, by the way, in between. And it's just a list of anecdotes, including never besiege a city, right? It doesn't make any sense. And people think that Sun Tzu is this deep thing that really... Even there are things that the same von Clausewitz would say, the same Jomini would say. But in this sense, the all-encompassing vision that von Clausewitz provides, with a full spectrum of possibilities can happen, and showing you how everything can be flipped at a given moment, and so that you, if anything, have to concentrate on how to adapt to that rather than to pretend that things will go essentially that anecdotal way, is the key to it all. And again, I can't stress this enough. Jomini was a great person, admitted, I was wrong, von Clausewitz was right, and it is beautiful, right? And we're sure somehow von Clausewitz knew that, even after he had passed away, because he knew that in the moment in which he was writing the Von Kriege. So he didn't have to be told by anyone. And I often say that I'm not a follower, right? That in my life, I never really had a role model in absolute terms. You could say, okay, well, you look up to your father, you look at models, or family, friends. But in general, like, I've never, said, okay, this specific hero or character or actor or politician, oh my God, I want to be like him or whatever. And what I've done with von Clausewitz here is also, like, probably I would dislike von Clausewitz in person. I'm not even sure, again, I vibe, in any personal sense with him. But I truly fell in love with the theory. I mean, the genius of this person. I am moved to tears when I think about it, because if we only realized, and it's relatively easy. I mean, it's actually difficult, yes, but it's not difficult because, to understand von Clausewitz, it's not because he made it difficult, but because of our own fault, because of our preconceptions, because of things should go that way, and that simplistic dumbification of everything, right? Everything would be so simpler, at least, right? And we refuse, like, we keep making the mistake that even very intelligent people like Jomini did, and people that also were not just intelligent, but they had really seen warfare, they'd seen Jena, Eylau, Berezina. I mean, do you realize what these names are about? Like, it's rough, right? It's something insane, right? So he would understand the moral dimension of it. But von Clausewitz, in this sense, makes his own the deeper experience of command in a deeper strategic sense. And also and I want to make some work about this, because there is, you would be surprised by how much von Clausewitz even drew in a conceptual sense, and was in this sense resumed also by the later Prussian military doctrine from things like, I don't know, that you can't find in folk fairy tales, also like the one collected by the Grimm brothers that we also made a video on, like in the one about the slumbering monarchs in medieval the German folklore, and applied it in this deeply more human, less abstracted, but indeed much more directly verifiable and experienceable sense. Jomini is already trying to abstract, to reduce everything to a bit like what the Greeks did. In this sense, it's as if the French with Jomini had been a bit more the Thucydides, the Greeks of the situation, and the Prussians had been the Romans of the situation, who said you can't really abstract everything into a rational ideal, even if the ideal was to work, provided that, again, in the 19th century, actually, Jomini did not realize in the still traditional ways that classical Greeks, in spite of all, still did. But the Romans would tell you in that sense that you cannot separate the warrior ethos from rational discipline. That for how important actually the latter is, if you extremize it, you can't actually fight real wars without the former. It doesn't matter how truly rigidly subordinated to discipline that was. It was clear in Roman civilization. And this is essentially what the same Prussians conceived. Like, that's, you could argue also why the French eventually declined compared to the Prussians, while maintaining still a first class, still today sort of military standard, because they had started abstracting in modernistic terms and had started to stop leaving the direct. I mean, consider that Germany had, with the Napoleonic Wars and even partially beyond, in time, does truly emerge from feudalism, does truly emerge from the medieval world. These were incredibly, even back, the same Napoleon did not advocate for enforcing, for example, a centralized model in Germany because it wouldn't work. Like, the societal standards were too still primitive for something like that. But in this sense, there was also something closer, if you look in the rigid Prussian militarism, to that higher ideal of military service that even with Kant, as we've seen in the various philosophical implication of the reforms pioneered by von Scharnhorst together with von Clausewitz, had started emerging also in the German Enlightenment and so on. So understanding the differences between von Clausewitz and Jomini, as far as also our channel is concerned, is understanding the difference between a deeper, more traditional way of seeing war in this connubium between innovation and tradition. It is basically between tradition and modernity, tradition and conservatism and innovation, so to say, that all great and successful military civilizations found themselves in. And this is true also for the French during Napoleonic Wars to an extent, right? But by their own scale. This is true for the Romans back in it. There is all a specific point in which these two tendencies provide the best synthesis, right? And in this sense, von Clausewitz, Prussia during the Napoleonic era, surely expresses this to provide us still today, because we still are within that nation-statal framework, the highest description of warfare that has ever been produced in the history of mankind. Nobody has ever surpassed von Clausewitz since death 1832. But back to Jomini, because, again, the comparison is key here. Especially read this as a time machine. Like, go back in time, first of all, read Jomini and say, oh, look at how the French wrote in the 19th century. And then get yourself amazed by how the Prussians had written just like a few, from Clausewitz, just a couple of decades before, right? And already, by the way, what is interesting, we were hinting at before, is that Jomini was aware by the 30s of von Clausewitz and sort of the broader criticism, because von Clausewitz knew of Jomini's work and was already criticizing that, right? So Jomini was a bit too high and mighty in that moment and to simply collect, and von Clausewitz died, and it's only later that Jomini said, look, he had his time to reflect on this and to understand also von Clausewitz, that he had read eventually by 38, where he wrote his own masterpiece. And even after that, so admitting how invalidated it was by the Clausewitzian theory in some fundamental core tenet principles, he admitted it, right? So it's extraordinary. But also, let's talk a little bit more about what he thought. For example, Jomini stressed the identification of what he called in French as point décisif. That list we were talking about before. So basically combining strategical value with favorable ground, right? He basically spotted these places almost like just like the material side of the story, like where the enemy is, what point on the ground must be taken. And again, even by liminal proceeding, this is not wrong, right? But it does not take into consideration the moral aspects, the unknown, how you have to go for it, right, in a broader sense, and how these are also part, equally, in the enemy's view of a broader strategy. Something that travalicates this vision of yours is basically like a tunneled one, where you think that things have to basically just follow that course, and they won't. Also because the enemy has, at that point, not created a roadmap for his own defeat, right? Why can you identify this decisive point? For what, right? Aside from the fact that von Clausewitz doubles down saying, the only decisive clash is the last, indeed, right? Which is the best definition for it. Like, as long as somebody fights, evidently that the last fight wasn't decisive. Decisive is very much used, as you know, at least there is a minimal pop cultural awareness in the property of it. When everything is this big battle that does not bring an end to the war. But again, this was decisive, like, I don't know, Stalingrad, Midway. There weren't decisive battles of World War II, just to make an example for that. Now, the theory of Jomini stressed the superiority of the offensive in conferring freedom of maneuver. In particular, he, again, was evidently very impressed, surfing the wave of Napoleon, the Grande Armée at the peak of his glory. Had seemed like, oh my God, if you can move, if you have free hand, you can do everything. Yeah, okay, but because that's the Grande Armée, all right? Just by scale, command, quality, and more resources of France and so on. But what about you're not there? And especially, what can you do exactly with this maneuver? Right? That doesn't solve the problem. Even the offensive must resolve very arduous puzzles, very arduous issues that indeed are actually, in fact, requiring the greater commitment. So Clausewitz explains you how it's in the offensive that all the elements of his own trinity, that I will not repeat what it is today, must be effectively combined. Right? For the defensive, yes, it's true. It's a negative form of war, which means that it's not leading anywhere in the moment, because you're inferior. You can't simply attack and smash the enemy, because otherwise you would do it, right? But in this sense, also has an inherent advantage that makes the defensive itself even easier, but still more effective in relative terms to the defense. And so this does not mean that every time you will use the defensive will win, but let's say in general, like at that famous abstract, in fact, non-existing parity of conditions, the defensive would have the upper hand, right? But we know that also in war, it's not quite just like that all the time. It just tendentially is, right? And still, paradoxically, it's the offensive that, yes, make things done as a war. There wouldn't be any war if somebody didn't start it, for that matter. In the examination of battles, Jomini classified offensive orders of battle: simple, parallel, reinforced on wing or center; simple or reinforced oblique, echelon on wing or center, perpendicular on one or both flanks, convex or concave, as culminations of envelopment, and combine assaults, presenting them as flexible geometric abstractions adaptable to terrain, relative strengths, and enemy dispositions rather than rigid templates. It's just like when in video games, and this is the exact metaphor, the correct parallelism. You have this idea of deploy the squad in this formation. I used to play Operation Flashpoint, Cold War Crisis. You have as the team commander, essentially platoon commander, even though it was limited just to 12 men. Form this staggered column. Practical effect, it depended entirely on the situation. Actually, you never used that because at the end of the day, aside from the game mechanics, it didn't make much of a difference. Sometimes it did, right? If you have to infiltrate somewhere, you have to squeeze in. Like, of course, a column is the best if you have, if you want, in that sense, to bet everything on your leadership and spare your men from a wide lateral fire. You want just to find the right infiltration point. This kind of mentality. So basically, Jomini said, literally showed you this pattern, this model formations. You know what did this all the time? The Greeks, right? The Greeks in their treatises, in their manuals, and surely in Western civilization there was an influence and a legacy of that. You would say, oh, look at how we can form, a globe. Or, this other form. Also the Romans later, when they were Hellenized, basically contributed to this. But we think today, even just as military historians, that those formations at large were highly think about Arians' deployment against the Alans. It's not like the Romans would simply go to war like that. We don't even understand, first of all, what they were saying, the terms of the spaces, whatever. They weren't writing. That's what you realize for... This is typical of military treatises before von Clausewitz. Only in the 18th century that formations are... that treatises on the art of war are meant to properly provide an expendably positive information on how to fight. If you read those ancient treatises, there were just some symbolical divertissement that were connected to military practice, but not in the way we intended, in a direct positive application of the same. I also made a video about this concerning the alleged influence of Macedonian and Roman tactics, etc., on the development of the Dutch tactics of the time of Maurice of Nassau. At this point in history, like historiography realizes that it's completely BS, right? But even in a broader sense, not obviously, in fact, the pikemen of the 16th century were not the Macedonian ones of the 4th BC, all right? But in general, it was a completely different type of warfare. And certain models are just anecdotal and must be understood mostly in a cultural sense. That is important because understanding why, a 16th century Dutch general would think like that is important in a broader contextual sense, in a broader background, personal vision and things, but they themselves did not write for that purpose, and it's only contemporary people were dumb and ignorant enough to think that they did. In fact, they attribute them something that they weren't properly even trying to do themselves. And in that sense, in fact, Jomini can be appreciated for the gigantic effort and contribution to the theory of the art of war that in many cases definitely stands on its feet. It's not like he was writing something that is absolutely invalidated in this or that circumstance. It is, however, if you want to establish, like von Clausewitz successfully did, something that, as he explains, basically at most, given how you have to really mostly solve problems by yourself, just a manual that you have to read in the moment of how to, know how to cross a river in general terms and evaluate the situation by eyeballing it, and then you will have to do it by yourself. Jomini was mostly trying to make sense of some absolutes that he probably saw to be attainable, but abstracting them, in fact, from the broader picture of this comprehensive, especially, this is very important for the sake of command and ultimate unity of it at the highest levels, in a comprehensive sense, right? Even as a commander, if you stop strategizing on these minimal things as if they were themselves the path to it and not the bigger picture for what you have to do in a more prospectively important, right, objective sense, you will make mistakes. You will not see the broader horizon. You will remain stuck to a more contingent and sort of narrow view of the world that will eventually backfire on you as the situation on the ground constantly develops against you if you don't exploit everything that is exploitable, right? Especially when you corner an enemy, especially when they have a much greater motivation than you, right, to fight well, right? And this is a great lesson for any student of the art of war, for that matter. Although recognizing that war as a whole constitutes an art rather than an exact science, Jomini sought to render strategy and operations susceptible to a degree of scientific regularity, exceeding that permitted by von Clausewitz's dialectical approach. So in other words, while he said, yes, reality is imperfect, and therefore most of what you have to do at war is you have to learn by yourself in a way or another. Still, well, we could actually draw a manual where you can literally, follow the paths, the steps, and you will win, even if you have nothing to do with military education in that sense, or profession and so on. Von Clausewitz says no, right? First of all, there isn't such a thing like a manual of this kind, and even to presume that there can be one that you can apply in the moment is already to lose. Because the moment you open the page and you're not able instead to eyeball the situation from the field, the enemy is taking advantage of you. And this is very relatable in many different ways. So von Clausewitz, as you know, has a theory of the art of war is very similar to the one of games. And that explains to you, in fact, this unpredictability of the situation, this Schrödinger victory, almost. In as much as, again, the Schwerpunkt must be followed, but in its changing fashion, right? And it's not like war that changes per se. It's the way war is waged that does. People tend to say, okay, well, war, what war is von Clausewitz discussing? Because literally he speaks even in a non-classificatory sense. Von Clausewitz uses, for example, the same words for describing different things throughout the von Krieg. And if I tell you this, it says, okay, so he's imprecise. No, he's exactly precise. Because he's showing you the semantic depth in the limit of our knowledge when there is, and he's incredibly able to, in this sense, render the perfect explanation with the right description and giving literally different descriptions and definitions of the same thing that must not be understood as courageously, but just different facets of the same mechanism. And again, von Clausewitz has also beautiful prose, as a matter of fact, because it's almost poetic, as a matter of fact. This is really an evergreen. We could be talking about von Clausewitz and Jomini in difference for so long, right? Also, the dialectical aspect of it all is important because at the end of the day, these guys were also writing not just for the sake of command, right? And so this idea that you can practically and positively spend these notions, these principles, in a way or in another, depending on the nature of the content. But they were also arguing against one another. They had to be internally coherent. This is also something that you have to test by yourself, literally talking to yourself, but also you have to be understood by others, and you must. And that's also why, by the way, the Clausewitzian theory is so misunderstood, because people are not normally capable of understanding bigger systems. It's not like von Clausewitz is not clear, or it's difficult to, it's sort of complicated, you get lost yourself. It's telling the truth is that you never actually studied him. You never actually translated him. You never actually made the attempt of sorting that out. Nobody reads anymore. Nobody cares about specific content anymore. It's like, I don't know, my video. If you look at all the misinformation there is out there, how basically almost no one understands what the hell I'm talking about. It's not much because what I'm saying is, I don't know, higher, sophisticated, or on the worst case, bad or poorly explained. It's because literally people do not have the time, the patience, the discipline to simply sit here and say, okay, let's see where he gets with this. Because there is always a point. Ever since I started the channel, there was always a point for everything. Remember when I say, oh, we have to see it in here, we have to see it in this other video. I will talk more about this. We've seen in that video already, etc. Because this is a whole system. And if you presume that these are standalone videos just to entertain you, you're wrong, because they're part of a more comprehensive view for which none of this is random, right? Or, I don't know, I wake up in the morning and even the lotteries, I chose the lottery mechanism. It's mostly just like randomizing what subject within it will come up, not being surprised from my side, from yours, maybe, yes, what kind of topic could appear, because I chose them deliberately as part of a wall, right? Jomini had definitely a preference for orderly, linear, professionalized warfare reminiscent of the Ancien regime. In fact, this is also part of his limit. As we were pointing out before, it's as if he had partially remained at Frederick II, right? And even though he lived in the eye of the storm through some of the most famous campaigns of the Napoleonic Wars, he did not have, as we've seen, but that kind of practical, indirect experience of higher command. It was never promoted to that level. As a consequence, his perception of the chaotic, mass-mobilized, and ideologically driven character of Revolutionary and Napoleonic War was actually limited. This is incredibly important to understand as well, right? Again, von Clausewitz probably talked from a different position of command. You could argue, however, that it's probably like the intellectual foundations of the Clausewitzian work that reached more far in a conscious sense. There were all great generals, greater than von Clausewitz in direct command experience and so on. They could have not necessarily written what von Clausewitz did. This is the case also for, I don't know, the Romans did not even have a word for strategy, right? And they spoke, in any case, another language. I mean, not even the Greeks meant by strategy what we mean by strategy, right? And there are different definitions for that matter, ever more changing and confusing today, as we've seen also in the video about Schwerpunkt, that clarifies much. But in this sense, von Clausewitz was grasping more deeply probably the political, moral, and cultural nature of his times, right? Jomini was a sort of privileged observer, surely of the atrocities firsthand. Again, he contributed to different operational circumstances. He contributed truly also in a strategic sense. He understood warfare. He was not such, like, he was intelligent. He definitely deserved his posts, his roles, but what did he actually get from this? And definitely his doctrines exerted commanding authority as well over military education and practice, as we've seen in Russia, France, Britain, Germany, Belgium, particularly the United States. This is also very interesting, where translations and expositions by Henry Wager Halleck, together with the interpretative work of Professor Dennis Hartmann at West Point, permeated the curriculum and profoundly influenced the strategic thinking of officers who commanded on both sides during the American Civil War. I have a series I recently, on the US Civil War, recently uploaded yet another episode. I really want to talk about Mahan. But again, the impact, if you wonder what kind of ideas were out there before von Clausewitz, it was definitely Jomini's. So it's important in this sense also to appreciate an apparent wrong, namely the fact that the best theory was not embraced, because aside from the fact that Germany had yet to come out of its own show, Prussia even, as the sort of more qualitatively indoctrinated military, let's put it in this way, in the world, and this will not happen until the 70s of the 19th century. But in this sense, after in the incredibly escalatory era in terms of civilizational development and the Napoleonic Wars really were, the doctrine that emerged the most was Jomini's. And so one must understand also why it happened at the time. Not much why, for example, we're much more vibing with Jomini as moderns than with von Clausewitz, which is also actually answering the same question. But in this sense, why in the 19th century much of our world was molded the way we know it? And in this sense, how limited it was not to understand the better theory. And so it's incredibly important to, I think, talk about these topics, because you can appreciate more than a thought. You can appreciate more than an author. Some of you said, okay, well, explain to us Jomini because we want to know something more in depth about him, etc. Again, we can make more videos about Jomini. Actually, my intention at large is to finish von Clausewitz's work at large that is much more important and actually much more prolific. I mean, von Clausewitz wrote certain things that are astonishingly important. I was just reading what I was reading them for regarding Napoleon's campaign, the first Napoleon's campaign in Italy. But just for saying, you can study military history through that. We've seen it also through the Kriege, as far as everything is exemplified with this or that military historical event, even from very long time before. Von Clausewitz talks about, I don't know, saying Gustavus Adolphus, Charles XII. It's plenty of extraordinary insight. So even with von Clausewitz, it doesn't stop to the Kriege. It doesn't stop to just a particular vision of this or that author. We must start embracing a historical vision of the authors in order to understand their work, because and also where they came from with this, because as we've seen today with Jomini, there is a very sort of historically determinate reality with authors, also with literature in general. Like, sort of, I don't know how to explain this, like, never found a proper distinction in English, like classical literature, the one you read almost like fiction or something similar. We tend, especially in those very fields, we tend to assume like that while this is naturally very good historical work, because if we read, again, War and Peace, we're looking at a time of that is later from Napoleonic Wars themselves, but let's say is in and of itself something written by someone who's living back in the 19th century. All right, not just from a military perspective and so on. And there you have von Clausewitz misunderstood by the paranoid and humanistic Russian lens. There was betraying tradition, and in that sense also that Prussian excellency in this incredibly tormented moment in history. But the literary standards is mostly based on things like anecdotes, right? Not a structural understanding, not a theoretical studying, not something that you can start understanding permeating your own very soul. Personally, with von Clausewitz, it was something like this. It was basically the realization that what he was describing was actual warfare. It was something that I started using also as because it is a military historical interpretative model, right? And again, if you don't do this for a living, if you don't know how effective this turns out to be, again, what are we looking at exactly? Like, how can you explain this to a person? In von Clausewitz, I, again, was already a military historian before reading von Clausewitz, and again, it is admittedly difficult to read von Clausewitz, but for the reasons we're just reasserting here, namely the fact that people don't make the effort to understand it, which is, again, a completely different thing from what you would normally imagine from a dedicated person who wants to understand a theory. But von Clausewitz's work is directed at everyone. You can read it and you will understand it. There are some metaphors that are at the time also quite usually written for bakers, even for people that would have to understand certain menial jobs, and therefore something that will partially also for this reason spread more among civilians, right? This is yet another paradox, and as well as the fact, by the way, that von Clausewitz is still not fundamentally absorbed in a doctrinal sense across the world. Like everybody knows who von Clausewitz is, or at least everybody, I mean in the military in general, like whoever teaches military academies, at least knows who von Clausewitz was, why we study him, but up just to a certain point, and there is no such thing like a coherently shared sense that the Clausewitzian theory should uniformly be issued in order to have a proper military education, properly for the functionality of our military. This is something which, again, is not there. Von Clausewitz was never adopted like that. And his reception was actually quite scarce. Nobody really decided to make all their armed forces about the Clausewitzian theory. And very often, for not talking about the fact, there are some people who even teach in certain, military academies and do not, and we're talking, Sandhurst, West Point, and so on, that do not know the von Krieg. It seems as if they had neither even opened it. They talk almost by interposed person, or I don't know what, right? And so this is very strange and dangerous at the same time, because one thing is also not understanding something. One thing is misportraying it and essentially preventing other people from understanding it better and being able to do something about it and with it. And that's also kind of terrifying, really. And I don't even know how to, I'm startled by this, really. I am very glad, however, of having made this video, because it's one of those, you really want to make from years, and you lack sort of not the courage, but you say, okay, let's wait for it, because we still have to get somewhere with this and so on. And I'm not sure that, again, this is going to be viewed more than other videos, unfortunately, with Schwerpunkts like this. Like, if it is not about drama, the views do not come, right? So it's quite frustrating in a way, but I hope that also those videos, for all the wrong reasons, and mostly reasons that are outside of my control, because the videos are not even designed to create drama in particular. It just happens that people have sort of some drunken reactions to this, but hopefully they will help giving visibility to this specific content. And again, for Jomini, this I think was really worth it, because it's one of those persons you tend to, I personally feel more akin to him in a personal sense, not much because I'm firstly Clausewitzian and I would never trade Jomini theory for that, but in a personal sense, I believe that I am more resemblant to him. And so it makes you think, because it makes you think about your own limitations as much as sort of the possibility of making things right in the end. And Jomini really did so with von Clausewitz. And so I want to see them as friends, the fact that they like each other, they care about each other, as they did, because they worked on each other's work to an extent. And so terrible times. And unfortunate moment. Had we had von Clausewitz for other 20 years, that would have, and maybe clashing with Jomini, with other publications, that would have been maybe like a much greater sort of gift to the history of mankind that they already were the way they did. But in fact, we have to be humble and accept that it's exactly this limitation, and especially through that Clausewitzian lens of things, that should make us understand that not everything that is immediately understandable is the better, right? That there are certain things that it's worth fighting for a long time before getting any of it, or maybe not even getting any of it in the end, but still leaving a mark and doing something that for someone will have been enough. I think this is very important. And definitely the von Krieg, I don't know, helped me, like even in my life, outside of the military sphere, because it's a great philosophy treatise. And there are those things again that you wouldn't know how much aside from talking with von Clausewitz about everything and all of this, but just to tell him thank you. Well, I would like to thank also Jomini, because he really offers a paradigm of honesty, of intelligence, and of humanity that we can't really look into and say, well, there is a positive in life as well, and let's appreciate it for what it is, and let's be just aware that, of course, it's always a struggle and there's always something new to learn. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.